Okay, we've got about 10 after, so I'm going to get started. First of all, by saying it would have been good to have had time to give you a general account of Ulysses, which, as you probably know, has been regarded by many people, including myself, as the blockbuster of the 20th century. In the year 2000, Random House conducted a survey among a select group of editors and then general readers as to what was the best novel written in English in the 20th century, and both lists came up with Ulysses on the top. I've got a friend in Switzerland who's in his 70s and who now in his life only reads Joyce and Homer because he doesn't have time to waste on secondary figures like Shakespeare and so on and so forth. Ulysses broke the laws. If you buy a copy of the novel, you'll find in the front of it a brief from the federal court telling you that this book is okay to read. Not even Mein Kampf or the sayings of Chairman Mao comes with that kind of disclaimer. Because for 13 years in this country, you could not read Ulysses, and then in 1 week, after we got a New Deal president, you could drink a beer and read Ulysses at the same time. Okay, so Eliot showed up at Virginia Woolf's house with his hands trembling as he read Ulysses in installments, saying that Joyce had exposed the futility of all styles and destroyed his own future. Woolf paid Joyce the tribute of writing Mrs. Dalloway as a kind of a compliment to Ulysses. F. Scott Fitzgerald at a party in Paris told Joyce that if Joyce wanted him to, he would throw himself out of a 3-story window. He was drunk. Joyce said, "That's okay, you don't have to do that." And Faulkner talked about Ulysses as a writer's Bible. And a few brief words on the reading we'll do for next week. We start Faulkner, who's tortuously difficult, both because of his syntactical style. Sentences will go on for pages. And the narrative is also complex and tortuous. The story is not told straightforwardly. You get bits and pieces of it. And it's also a book that explores Southern racist society, and so it's full of the N-word. I just want to make you aware of these aspects of Faulkner. My advice would be to read it slowly rather than fast. Enjoy the prose rather than trying to whip through it. Okay, so I realize I've thrown you into the deep end of the pool here by giving you a chapter of Ulysses from the middle of the book without giving you a context, but I think you can draw a lot of inferences about what's going on in it just by reading it. So let's look at the first paragraph, which puts us right in the middle of Mr. Leopold Bloom's mind. We're looking at Dublin, Ireland, in particular a candy store, looking through the window at different types of candy: pineapple rock, lemon plat, and butterscotch. And then the shop girl, a sugar-sticky shop girl, shovels scoopfuls of cream for a Christian brother. That would be a Catholic schoolboy. So you're seeing a boy in a candy stop buying fruit, and then it sees a sign on the candy store that this candy store are lozenge and confit manufacturers to the king. So we're seeing Dublin, but as it's filtered through Bloom's eyes. And then immediately, one of several moments in the chapter that's puzzling and I want to go through first before talking about the chapter generally. A somber YMCA young man, watchful among the warm, sweet fumes of Graham lemons, placed a throwaway in the hand of Bloom. Can you smell like the sticky sugar, the kind of cotton candy or butterscotchy smell you get outside of candy stores, the warm, sweet fumes? He places a throwaway in Mr. Bloom's hand. Heart-to-heart talks? Bloom? Me? No, blood of the Lamb. Slow feet walked him riverward reading. Are you saved? All are washed in the blood of the Lamb. God wants blood victim, birth, hymen, martyr, war, foundation of a building, sacrifice, kidney burnt offering, Druid's altars. Elijah's coming. Dr. John Alexander Dowie, restorer of the church in Zion, is coming, is coming, is coming. It's an evangelical Christian man throwing out a flyer advertising the evangelical campaign of Alexander Dowie, a real person, American, who founded the city of Zion, Illinois, and who conducted an evangelical crusade in Dublin in 1904. The confusion is that Bloom looks at the handout and sees the letters BLOO and thinks it's his name, but it's actually the blood of the Lamb, which leads to a kind of confusion between Bloom and the Messiah, and it raises the question for people who have been reading Ulysses from the beginning of whether or not Bloom can be the new Messiah. I'm going to table that question, come back to it if there's time, but that's a difficult moment. And then on page 156, Mr. Bloom runs into somebody called Josie Breen, who you gradually learn in the novel was the woman that Bloom was dating as a young man before his wife met him, Molly. So it's his old girlfriend, and she's frumpy and married to this kind of lunatic who later in the book is said to be so stupid that he has to put his hat on with a shoehorn in the morning. He's received an anonymous postcard from somebody that says on page 158, UP, it's not even clear what it says. It might just say UP. or UP up. And though it's anonymous, he doesn't know who's sent it. He's taking out a libel suit for £10,000. He's off his gourd. So the question is, like, what is it about this postcard that irritates Dennis' brain? And there are 20 or 30 articles in the Joyce trade that talk about how it might mean that Dennis' brain puts fingers up places where fingers were never meant to go, how the jig is up with him, how he can't get it up anymore. It could mean UP, you piss, you're no good. And in Ireland, it turns out UP means under proof, or for like weekend whiskey, not quite up to par. So I'm not going to make a decision about these many meanings, but it does raise the question, if the letters U and P can generate so many conflicting readings, what do we do with the letters L-E at the beginning of the chapter and lemon, or any two letters in Ulysses? It's a kind of invitation to open the book and make it widely readable. Then on page 154, there's a moment where Bloom, is it 154? Now, it's at the bottom of 166. Actually, no, on 154, the word is mentioned, parallax. It's toward the top of the page in the first long paragraph. Bloom is looking at a time ball that goes down on a pole on a building in the center of Dublin. Time ball in the ballast office is down. Dunsink time. Fascinating little book that is of Sir Robert Ball's. Parallax. Ball was the astronomer at the observatory, and he wrote a book that mentions parallax. I never exactly understood. There's a priest. Could ask him. It's Greek, like parallel, parallax. Metempsychosis, she called it, till I told her about this transmigration. His wife has asked him to define the word metempsychosis earlier, and she's pronounced it metempsychosis. So he thinks about the word parallax here and doesn't know what it means, but he actually illustrates it on page 166 in the last paragraph. He's standing in front of an optician's store. The optician had a sign out in front, suspended, it was in the shape of a pair of glasses. And in the last paragraph, he faced about and standing between the awnings, held out his right hand at arm's length toward the sun. Wanted to try that often. Yes, completely. The tip of his little finger blotted out the sun. Must be the focus of the raised cross. So he's doing this familiar game that we've all done where you close one eye and then block I'm going to block the exit sign with my finger. I can't see it now. But if I close the open eye and open the closed eye, my finger jumps about a foot. You should try this millions of times every day. What it illustrates is that you need two eyes to see anything, or two perspectives. And it's an important concept to a novel in which there are two main characters, and in which meaning is never finally arrived at, but is always kind of deferred. You get one point of view, and Bloom is the Messiah, and then you look at it from the other point of view. No, he's not. He's just like a sad sack, a pathetic middle-aged Dubliner. Well, the truth must lie some place in between, and then you take up that truth and build another one until you move in the process of generating meaning. Then there's a moment on page 176 where Bloom thinks about going to the museum after eating his lunch to see statues of naked goddesses. Ace digestion. They don't care what man looks. All to see. Never speaking. I mean to fellows like Flynn. Suppose she did Pygmalion and Galatea. What would she say first? Mortal. Put you in your proper place. Quaffing nectar at mess with gods. Golden dishes, all ambrosial. Not like the Tanner lunch we have. Boiled muttons, carrots and turnips, bottle of Allsop. Nectar. Imagine it drinking electricity. God's food. Lovely forms of woman, sculpt Junonian. Immortal lovely. And we stuffing food in one hole and out behind. Food, child, blood, dung, earth, food. Have to feed it like stoking an engine. They have never looked. I'll look today. Keeper won't see. Bend down, let something fall, see if she, you fill in the blank, has an anus. So this is Bloom's curiosity about the body. And also it's Joyce commenting on the difference between his realism and the realism of virtually anybody else you've read in Western literature. Would you ever guess that people defecate if you read most of the books that we've read? That people have assholes. There's one part of this book where Bloom sits on the toilet in the outhouse and reads a Reader's Digest article while he's doing it. He reads 2 columns, which tells us he does 2 columns. It was a scene that really disturbed Virginia Woolf. And Peter Walsh at the end of Mrs. Dalloway thinks how odd it is that now people are writing about water closets in little magazines. I think she's got Joyce in mind there. Anyway, Joyce shows humans in their entirety. They have the holes that the statues of the goddesses and other represented beings don't. Then finally, the last confusing moment is page 183, the closing, where the prose gets kind of staccato. Mr. Bloom came to Kildare Street. First I must, library, straw hat and sunlight, tan shoes, turned-up trousers. It is, it is. His heart quapped softly. To the right, museum, goddesses. He swerved to the right. Is it? Almost certain. Won't look. Wine in my face. Why did I? Too heady. Yes, it is. The walk, not see, not see. What's happened here is that Bloom has run into a man named Blazes Boylan, who's going over to his house in the afternoon. He's a concert manager. He's going over to Bloom's house to practice a concert with his wife, but Bloom has got intimations that his wife is going to do the dirty deed with Blazes Boylan and cheat on him. Bloom has gotten this news in the morning that Boylan is coming over, and throughout the day he's anguished by the prospect of his wife cheating on him and sleeping with another man. And so at the end of the chapter, you see his agitation as he's trying to pretend he's not seeing this guy and is patting himself all over, pretending to look for something as if he's electrocuted. So those are the difficult moments. And let me run through the chapter more broadly now by asking what it accomplishes or what it tells us about Bloom and what you might have gained. For one thing, one of the first things you learn about Leopold Bloom on the first page in which he's presented is that he's a person of kindness and curiosity. And I think we see a lot of his kindness in this chapter. This is one reason why it's possible to see Bloom as a messiah. When Joyce was writing Ulysses, a friend of his would ask him what he was doing, and Joyce would always say, what do you think of Bloom? And the friend, Frank Budgeon, asked him what he meant to portray in Bloom, and he said, a good man, a difficult thing to do. So Bloom's sympathy and kindness is immense. On page 151, he sees Dilly Daedalus, Stephen Daedalus' sister, and it's here that we learn that the Daedalus mother had 15 children. She dies at the age of 42 of liver cancer after having given birth to 15 children, and he feels bad for her poverty. On page 153, he looks at the birds floating on the river Liffey, and he feels bad for them and buys them some food and feeds them. On 154, he sees these guys doing advertising, wearing sandwich boards, advertising a stationery store, and he feels sorry for them because they're like minimum wage workers eating on the run. On 155, he remembers going to collect accounts at a nunnery, and he expresses pathos for the nuns, the women who go into nunneries and forsake their love life. He thinks that nuns invented barbed wire. And then he meets on page 158 Mrs. Breen, whom he feels terrible for because she used to be his girlfriend, but now she's dressed up in shabby clothes and she's married to this lunatic. Her life has become a kind of hell. And she tells him also about Mrs. Purefoy, a mutual friend who's been in labor for 3 days, and Bloom expresses compassion for her labor pains. At the end of the chapter, he helps a blind stripling across the street and then looks in the paper and reads that there was a boating disaster in the East River in New York. A ship that was carrying a group of church members on a picnic caught on fire, and like 150 people died. And Bloom feels terrible for them. So we see that Bloom is not callous and that he has a lot of sympathy for people. And you might think about sympathy, feeling for somebody else as a kind of emotional version of parallax, looking at things from another perspective. We also see a lot about Bloom's vulnerability. He's done what most people do when they get bad news. He's learned that his wife might be cheating on him, and his first impulse is not to think about it or to pretend that it's not happening. And he's done that throughout the 7 chapters preceding this. The moment at the end of the chapter tells you that he can't avoid Boylan anymore. But there are other things that occur to him, too, like this kind of cryptic passage on page 153. He's crossing the river Liffey and notices that somebody's put a boat out there with a little advertising sign in it, and he thinks about clever advertisements. At the very bottom of the page, McGinney the Dancing Master self-advertisement. This was a guy who used to walk around Dublin dressed up in like scarlet and purple clothes to call attention to his dancing academy. Self-advertisement. Got fellows to stick them up or stick them up himself, for that matter, on the QT, running in to loosen the button. Fly-by night. Just the place, too. This is a men's room. Post no bills. Post 110 pills. Some chap with a dose burning him. So he's thinking of some ad for venereal disease treatment. And then this passage, iffy? Oh. Eh? No, I don't believe it. He wouldn't surely. No. Mr. Bloom moved forward, raising his troubled eyes. And then he thinks about the word metempsychosis and of his wife asking him for the definition, and he smiles. Oh, rocks at two windows of the ballast office. She's right after all. She's not exactly witty, can be rude. And you get to see Bloom's affection for his wife here. But that little segment of no-nos is Bloom thinking about the possibility that Boylan might have an STD. They had them in 1904, and if so, there could be real consequences for his marriage. And then after he smiles at Molly saying, oh, rocks, on 155 he has a long memory of a outing they took to the Glencree dinner. Never put a dress on her back like it. Fitted her out like a glove, shoulder and hips, just beginning to plump it out. And then this phrase that recurs throughout the chapter, happy, happier than. Snug little room that was with the red wallpaper. And he thinks about giving his daughter a bath. The Blooms have been married for 16 years, and the news you get is that 11 years ago they had a son who died in the first 11 days of his life. He was stillborn. And since then, the Bloom sex life has been troubled. As Bloom puts it on page 168 in this chapter, could never like it again after Rudy. It's the fifth line down. I was happier then, or was that I? Could never like it again after Rudy. So the Blooms were very happy in the early years of the marriage, and then after the death of their son, things seem to have gone sour. And then at 156, he thinks about Molly walking home with Molly from a concert. Remember when we got home, raking up the fire and frying up those pieces of lap of mutton for her supper with the chutney sauce you liked and the mulled rum? Could see her in the bedroom from the hearth unclamping the busk of her stays. Swish and soft flop her stays made on the bed, always warm from her, always liked to let herself out, sitting there after till near 2, taking out her hairpins, Millie tucked up in Betty house, happy. That was the night. So a lot of fond memories of what he has to lose if he doesn't do anything about this impending adultery. He also thinks about Molly being pregnant on page 162 when he's thinking about Mrs. Purefoy. And on 167, you get a little passage in which he recalls seeing Molly and Boylan flirting with each other in his presence. This is one of the clues that tells you that they're carrying on. It's the middle paragraph on page 167. Wait, the full moon was the night we were Sunday fortnight exactly. There is a new moon. So there's a full moon on May 29th. So he's thinking about an outing that the three of them had on May 29th. Walking down by the Tolka. Not bad for a Fairview moon. She was humming, then the words of the song. He other side of her. Elbow, arm, he. More words of the song. Touch, fingers, asking, answer, yes. Stop. If it was, must. This is what he tends to do, is not think about this because it causes him great pain. And again on page 182, today, not think. There's also, as a sign of like how deep the attachment of Bloom and Molly is, a memory on page 175. The last paragraph on the page is preceded by a single sentence that says, stuck on the pane, 2 flies buzzed, stuck. Then we get a long description of Molly and Bloom walking on Howth Head, a natural area outside of Dublin, and he thinks about making love to her. And this is, it turns out, this is the same moment that Molly Bloom is remembering at the very last page of the book when she says, "Yes, I said yes, I will, yes." It's the day they decided to get married. And after Bloom has this memory, me and me now, stuck the flies buzz. It's like he's watching flies copulating and comparing that kind of lovemaking to what their love was when they were at the start of their lives and very happy. So you see, we get in this chapter a deeper sense of like Bloom's attachment to Molly and the amount that he has to lose. And also at the end, Bloom has run into Blazes Boylan once earlier while he was driving in a carriage with some people to a funeral. And at that moment, everybody leans out to say hi to Boylan, and Bloom looks at his fingernails, avoiding it. At the end of this chapter, he can't avoid it. It's like he's electrified by patting himself all over. And I think what Joyce is showing us is the way people react to depressing and anxiety-provoking news, that people tend to block it out at first. Today, not think. But gradually it surfaces, and by the end of this chapter, halfway through the book, I think the news that Bloom's marriage is in trouble has been digested, and he's got to deal with it. Now, I use the word digested deliberately, because, as you'll notice in the schema that Joyce wrote for Ulysses, he said that the style of the chapter was peristaltic. And what does that mean? Peristalsis, of course, is the process of contraction of the muscles of the alimentary tract from the throat all the way down through the to the stomach and through the intestines. It's the kind of like boa constrictor-like movement that digests food. The chapter is peristaltic in the sense that at one level I just punked you because I'm going to read all the passages I just read you and make them mean something different. They're going to be about food. So let's go back and read about the evangelical tract on the first page. After the italics paying game, polygamy, his wife will put a stopper on that. Where was that ad? Some Birmingham firm, the luminous crucifix? Our Savior. Wake up in the dead of night and see him on the wall, hanging. Pepper's ghost idea. Iron nails ran in. Phosphorus it must be done with. If you leave a bit of codfish, for instance, I could see the bluey silver all over it. Nutty went down to the pantry in the kitchen. Don't like the smells in it waiting to rush out. What was it she wanted? The Malaga raisins. Thinking of Spain. Before Rudy was born, the phosphorescence, that bluey greeny, very good for the brain. Now his mind is now like in the pantry, kind of ruminating among the various available foodstuffs. And at this point, his attention is attracted by Stephen Dedalus' sister, Dilly, and he feels bad about her poverty, but also looks with some judgmental severity on the church because the last two lines, the church will eat you out of house and home. No families themselves to feed. They live on the fat of the land. Their butters and larders, I'd like to see them do the black fast, Yom Kippur, crossbuns, 1 meal and a collation for fear he'd collapse. And then he looks at Dilly Dedalus. Good Lord, that poor child's dresses in flitter. Underfed she looks too. Potatoes and marge and potatoes. Always back to food. Now, he crosses the bridge, goes over the River Liffey, the Liffey that runs to the center of Dublin, just as you crossed over Strawberry Creek today. Did you wonder what Strawberry Creek tasted like? There was a period in your life when I know you know the top of this table tastes like because there was a period in your life when your knowing of the world was through your mouth. You negotiated on all fours, crawling on all fours, picking up everything you could find, cinders, cigarette butts, and putting it into your mouth. Top of this table, dusty, bitter, finally not palatable. So Bloom, as he crosses the river, thinks about somebody who jumped into the river and thinks, if I threw myself down, Reuben J's son must have swallowed a good bellyful of that sewage. So think about what a bellyful of Strawberry Creek water would taste like, because Bloom does. And then he notices the gulls. Joyce is now bringing to sight the out of mind by making us conscious of things unconscious. And he gets this little couplet of poetry. The hungry, famished gull flaps over the water stall. Now, when you read poems about birds, what are they usually about? Joyce provides a contrast on page 166 when Bloom sees two poets coming out of a vegetarian restaurant and thinks about poetry and thinks the dreamy, cloudy gull waves over the water's dull. So that's the way poets usually write about birds, is like creatures that can transcend the earth and take flight, like Shelley's skylark or Keats's nightingale. Nobody thinks about the hunger of birds, as Bloom does back on page 152. The hungry, famished gull. Keats would never have written that line. It's about the bird's hunger. And so Bloom buys, first of all, he crumples up the evangelical tract and throws it into the water, and the birds don't go for it because they're not suckered by literature the way humans are. They want food. And so Bloom buys them food and feeds them, doing the equivalent of what Elijah does, doing better than what Elijah does in the Old Testament, because Elijah is fed by birds who drop manna down onto him. Bloom is a better Messiah because he feeds the birds. And then let's notice where his thoughts now go, because they undergo a series of amplifications and inversions that typify for me the chapter. He starts, after having fed the birds and wondered about like what they eat, his thought turns to swans from they live on fleshy fish. They have to. All seabirds, gulls, sea goose. Swans from Liffey swim down here sometimes to preen themselves. No accounting for tastes. Wonder what kind of swan meat. Robinson Crusoe had to live on them. And then the next paragraph, if you cram a turkey, say, on chestnut meal, it tastes like that. Eat pig like pig. Then why is it that saltwater fish are not salty? How is that? And then if you don't get it there, also on page 172 at the top, he he thinks about Christmas turkeys and geese. So back on page 153, in short, he's like started thinking about what the birds eat and then started to think about eating the birds. This becomes a kind of like natural cycle of hunger in which everything is turning into an edible plate, edible food. On page 170, there's a phrase I'll come back to, eat or be eaten. And it's not until page 158, when he's talking to Josie Brain, that the phrase "I'm hungry" occurs. But once you start to think about it and go back to the first paragraph where Bloom is kind of bathed in the smell of lemon candy, and then start to think about his pantry and that food is on his mind from the beginning. And look at what happens here when he's talking to Mrs. Breen on page 158. They're standing outside of a bakery. Flakes of pastry on the gusset of her dress. Dog of sugary flour stuck to her cheek. Are you ever so hungry that when you look at people, you notice the particles of food that are stuck to their clothing, as Bloom does here? And on the prior page, if you notice, when she opens her purse to take out the postcard, a piece of candy falls out, and Bloom's eye beelines for it. He's being attentive to food. So food is never very far from the surface of this chapter, just as it's not very far from the top of your mind right now that I've made it conscious. The chapter is primarily about Bloom's sympathy, his kindness, his curiosity, but at the same time, beneath this conscious surface, Joyce is making us aware of a kind of unconscious. I'll go back to a sentence on page 151, the first page of the chapter. His slow feet walked him riverwards, reading. A sentence that captures a sense of autonomicness or involuntary motion, the motion of the body of which the brain is not conscious. In short, the chapter is beginning to show us the unconscious impact of the body on the mind. And in particular, the chapter is giving us food for thought in exploring the importance of the belly and alimentation on thinking, the way the flesh plays into the head. So the chapter is, among other things, tearing apart 19th century dualisms between body and mind. You wouldn't have a mind if you didn't have a body and food to put into it. You'd be dead. So the body is very much part of Bloom's thinking throughout Ulysses and very much in this chapter. It's where I think Joyce out Freud's Freud, because for Freud, human activity is determined by what he calls genitality, sexuality, whereas in Joyce, all the organs of the body, the lungs, the brain, the liver, the spleen, the stomach in this chapter, and the genitals play into the mind and influence it. So let me just go back over some of the passages I read you and notice that they're in fact bearing on food. Why, after all, does Bloom sympathize with Mrs. Purefoy, the pregnant woman, except that it's helped to sympathize because he's got pains in his stomach too, not labor pains, but hunger pains. And, the nuns that he thinks about. I'm not going to do this with all the passages. You can do it on yourself, but the nun on page 155, glad to communicate with the outside world. Our great day, she said, Feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel. Sweet name, too, Caramel. And then he goes to think about what nuns eat. And he thinks at one point about police attacking mobs of rioting students, and he thinks about the police egging raw youths on, and so on and so forth. One way of reading this chapter is just go through it and see how many puns you can find on foodstuffs. So the moments that Bloom recalls with Molly, too, are all, it turns out, framed in food. So if we look at the Glen Creek dinner on page 155, which I read to you, she didn't like it because I sprained my ankle first day she wore choir picnic at the Sugarloaf. Sugarloaf is a mountain south of Dublin, but of course it functions as a food term here. Picnic at Sugarloaf, as if that. Old Goodwin's tall hat done up with some sticky stuff. Flies picnic, too. Flies have to eat. Never put a dress on her back like it. Fitted her like a glove, shoulder and hips. Just beginning to plump it out well. Rabbit pie we had that day. People looking after her. Rabbit pie. And on the next page, coming home from the concert, remember when we got home raking up the fire and frying up those pieces of lap of mutton for the supper with the chutney sauce you liked and the mulled rum? More food. And then that amazing passage on page 176 where Bloom remembers the day they got married. Ravished over her I lay, full lips full open, kissed her mouth. Yum. Softly she gave me in my mouth the seed cake warm and chewed. Mawkish pulp her mouth had mumbled, sweet and sour with spittle. Joy. I ate it. Joy. Young life, her lips that gave me pouting. soft, warm, sticky gum jelly lips. That's about as close to another person as you can get. Having them chew your food for you and then insert it into your mouth the way mother birds do to baby birds. It suggests that hunger it comes to mean something more than just physical hunger in this chapter, and that hunger can be used to express sexuality too. There are two references in this chapter to the breast. One on page 161 when Bloom is thinking about Mrs. Purefoy giving birth to infants, and it also thinks about Molly giving her breast to her children. And then the passage I just read you, where Bloom kisses Molly's breasts. The breast is our first source of food and our place of contact with the world. It's the place where we come in contact with mother. The Latin word for mother, it comes from an Indo-European root of the same form. And it also gives us the word matter. Like in the first 9 months of your life, you're embedded in mother, and every month after that, you're embedded in matter. You depend on matter as you depend on mother. And I think Joyce is showing us something of our dependency on things that are otherwise repressed in the novel, and things that are gendered feminine, like food and eating. Let's also note that, no, actually I want to go to a famous passage on page 168. The four-line paragraph at the bottom of the page, the three-line paragraph at the bottom of the page, a warm human plumpness settled down in his brain. His brain yielded. Perfume of embraces all him assailed. With hungered flesh obscurely, he mutely craved to adore. Duke Street, here we are, must eat. The Burton, feel better then. So there's a famous story about this paragraph. A friend of Joyce ran across him sitting on a bench in Paris and said, geez, you look exhausted. And Joyce said, I am. I've been working all day. I've been writing. And the friend said, you must have gotten a lot done. And Joyce said, well, no, I only wrote 2 sentences. And I had all the words yesterday. Today I was just figuring out how to arrange them. These are the 2 sentences. But I think what they're showing us is that hunger can kind of be, sexuality can be sublimated in hunger. And you probably know some people who use food as a replacement for other kinds of sensual relation, or other people who eat a lot of food in order to build up a kind of fatty body armor that ensures other people stay away. Food can be used as a weapon too. The chapter gets us to think about that in ways I'm not going to have time to explore. But because it's about the subliminal impact of hunger on the brain, it becomes a kind of encyclopedic meditation on the subject. In many ways, the chapter detailing, for instance, suggests that hunger could be regarded as a motivational force of world history. Marx tells us to think about history being propelled by these large economic forces and class struggles. Freud tells us to think about our lives being governed by the play of sexual forces. We might think about the role of hunger in motivating people's lives and determining the shape of culture and civilizations. On page 180, Bloom passes a bookstore, a Protestant bookstore. Mr. Bloom turned to Gray's confectioner window of unbarked tarts and passed the Reverend Thomas Connellan's bookstore. Why he left the Church of Rome, Bird's Nest, women run him. They say they used to give pauper children soup to change to Protestants in the time of the potato blight society over the way Papa went for the conversion of poor Jews. Same bait. So Bloom is thinking here of the Irish famine, which took the Irish population and halved it in the 1840s. And he's also recalling some episodes from the cultural history of Ireland when Protestants would give a Catholic soup or a sandwich if they would convert to Protestantism. So food can change people's minds. It can convert people to other religions. And then, interestingly, at the top of page 172, second line, peace and war depend. Actually, I'll start reading at the bottom of page 171 with kosher. No meat and milk together. Hygiene, that was what they call now. Yom Kippur, fast spring cleaning of inside. Peace and war depend on some fellow's digestion. Religions, Christmas turkeys and geese, slaughter of innocents, eat, drink, and be merry, then casual words full after. Heads bandaged, cheese digests all but itself, mighty cheese. That line, peace and war depend upon some fellow's digestion. How often has famine or the lack of food caused people to pick up and migrate and get into collisions and wars with other people? Hunger has been a motivating force of a lot of world movement. And in Bloom's thoughts about kosher here, you can't eat meat and milk together if you follow a kosher regimen. or eat shellfish, he thinks about it as being hygiene and suggests maybe that the books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, where kosher laws are laid out, are maybe a kind of desert survival manual. That if you're living in a desert in a hot climate, it makes sense you don't want to eat meat and milk or shellfish because they spoil easily and cause disease. And that opens up the chapter to a perspective that allows us to see it as a kind of exploration of dietary regimes and habits. And at this point, it gets very interesting. I'm going to go back to that line, eat or be eaten, kill, kill, which Bloom thinks about when he goes into the restaurant, the first restaurant he goes in. Eat or be eaten, kill, kill, which rhymes for me with a line I read you on page 151. God wants blood victim. His slow feet walked him riverward, walking. Are you saved? All are washed in the blood of the Lamb. God wants blood victim. The immediate reference is that it used to be a kind of common practice when you were building a building to pour some blood into the foundation stone, a kind of folkloristic superstition. But that line, God wants a blood victim, so do we all. Think about the things you eat and try to think about something you eat that is not dead, that has not been killed. You don't hear the vegetables screaming when you pull them up out of the ground, but they die. They die for you. And so this chapter for me becomes a kind of secular revision of the books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy and also Acts of the Apostles, where God tells Christians it's okay to have ham. So consider the range of possibilities you have as people with appetites. We've looked at what the gods eat. When Bloom thinks of the statues, nectar, imagine it drinking electricity. And they have no anuses, and so they don't have to have like material food. So that's one range of eating that's beyond our capability. But check out the eating activity on page 179. At Duke Lane, a ravenous terrier choked up a sick knuckly cud on the cobblestones and lapped it with new zest. Sir Feet returned with thanks, having fully digested the contents. First sweet, then savory. Mr. Bloom coasted warily. Ruminants, his second course. So at two extremes, you've got the gods eating electricity and the dogs eating vomit. There are people who do that these days. I ran across like an avant-garde website, UbuWeb, I think it's called, where there are people who nowadays will like force themselves to vomit and then eat it with spoons and then vomit. It's out there for you to enjoy if you want to. So we've got the dog at one extreme and the gods at the other. What about eating meat? Meat eaters. Bloom thinks about the cops eating meat and potatoes and therefore not having very developed brains. But the first restaurant he walks into, he sees all these guys eating with their mouths open and decides he doesn't want to eat there. And he also thinks about the food they're eating, corned beef and cabbage. The very first paragraph on 171. After all, there's a lot in that vegetarian. Fine flavor of things from the earth, garlic, of course. It stinks. Italian organ grinders, crisp of onions, mushrooms, truffles. Pain to animal, too. Pluck and draw fowl. Wretched brutes there at the cattle market waiting for the poleaxe to split their skulls open. Moo, poor trembling calves. Meh, staggering bob, bubble and squeak. Butcher buckets, wobble lights. Give us that brisket off the hook. Plop, raw head and bloody bones. Flayed glass-eyed sheep hung from their haunches. Sheep snouts, bloody papered, sniveling nose jam on sawdust. Top and lashers going out. Don't maul them pieces, young one. Hot, fresh bread they prescribe for decline. Blood always needed, insidious. Lick it up, smoking hot, thick, sugary, famished ghosts. So the pain to the animal that Bloom thinks about here, I'm sure you've all read about like slaughterhouses. If you took a contemporary novel with me last year and you got to read about slaughterhouses in Chicago and pensions against the day. My brother-in-law has a brother who worked in a slaughterhouse in Chicago for a week. His job was, as cattle would come down a corral, and he had a sledgehammer, and his job was to kill them by burning them right between the two eyes. He lasted a week, which is about the longevity for that job. But think about this the next time you enjoy a steak. You don't have to eat steaks. You can eat vegetarian food, as Bloom thinks when he sees the poets coming out of the vegetarian restaurant on page 165. Last paragraph. His eyes follow the high figure in homespun, beard and bicycle, a listening woman at his side, coming from the vegetarian. Only vegetables and fruit. Don't eat a beefsteak. If you do, the eyes of that cow will pursue you through all eternity. They say it's healthier. Wind and watery, though. Tried it. Keep you on the run all day. Bad as a bloater. Dream all night. What do they call that thing they gave me? Nut steak. Nutarians, fruitarians. To give you the idea you're eating rump steak. Absurd. Salty, too. They cook in soda. Keep you sitting by the tap all night. And then he looks at the female poet. Her stockings are loose over her ankles. I detest that. So tasteless. And then he goes on to think, I wouldn't be surprised if it was the kind of food you see produces the like waves of the brain, the poetical. For example, one of those policemen sweating Irish stew into their shirts, you couldn't squeeze a line of poetry out of him. So I wouldn't be surprised if it was the kind of food you see produces the like the waves of the brain, the poetical. My thinking is a product of food. Every day, all of us eat protein, which is related to the word protein. Protein, because no matter what you eat, you put it into your mouth, it will turn into fingernails, your foot, your head, your ears, your hair, or your thoughts, or your voice. Food is the building block of the body. It's amazing the number of things that people eat, and this chapter starts getting you to explore. There's a reference to nutarians and fruitarians in the paragraph I just read. Do you all know about those? There are people who only eat nuts and fruits because you don't have to kill them. You can wait for them to drop. This may be the most humane dietary regimen. And it says something, of course, about Bloom, that he walks the golden mean and doesn't eat meat or vegetable, but a cheese sandwich. You don't have to kill anything to eat cheese. You just take it away from its mom. But think about the things that people have decided to eat, as Bloom does on page 174. Last paragraph. Mild fire of wine kindles his veins. I wanted that badly. Felt so off color. His eyes unhungrily saw shelves of tins, sardines, gaudy lobsters' claws. All the odd things people pick up for food. Out of shells, periwinkles with a pin, off trees, snails off the ground the French eat, out of the sea with bait on a hook. Silly fish learn nothing in 1,000 years. If you didn't know, risky putting anything in your mouth. Poisonous berries. Roundness you think good. Gaudy color warns you off. One fellow told another and so on. Try it on the dog first. Led on by the smell or the look. You think about it, who discovered how to eat like shellfish or oysters or artichokes? I'm a New Yorker. The first month I got to California in 1970, somebody fed me an artichoke, which we didn't have on the East Coast, and I started eating the whole thing until they told me that wasn't the way you did it. About who discovered how to do that? And as Bloom thinks on page 179, who distilled first? These people are great contributors to our culture. They've given us things that maybe are more important to us than the collected work of John Milton. Artichokes and oysters, great cultural contributions that we tend not to think about. So think about the relativity of cuisine. On another level, the range of things that people eat, Bloom explores on page 171. I'm going to start out with, not 171, 175. About 7 lines down. That Archduke Leopold, was it? No, yes, or was it Otto? One of those Habsburgs? Or who was it used to eat the scruff off of his own head? Cheapest lunch in town. So now you can think about all the people you know who eat body parts, fingernails, scruff off the top of their head. The list goes, quite a menu there of available things. And then he also thinks on this page of the rich, what the rich eat. The elite, creme de la creme, they want special dishes to pretend they're hermit with a platter of pulse, royal sturgeon, venison, and so on and so forth. And then also the relativity of cuisine. He thinks at the top of this page about the Chinese eating eggs 50 years old, blue and green again. Dinner of 30 courses, each dish harmless, must mix inside. Idea for a poison mystery. And I'm sure you've all explored the cuisine of non-Western cultures and discovered some very bizarre things to eat. In Mexico, live insects. I was once offered a Philippine dish called balut, which is a hard-boiled egg in which there's the skeleton of the fetal chicken, so you get a crunch when you eat it. I passed that up. But cuisines vary from culture to culture. And then there's fast food. They had fast food in 1904 too, junk food. Bloom sees an advertisement for something called Plumtree's Potted Meat. It's like a spam product on page 171. Very last paragraph. He's just had a sandwich and thinks about sardines on shelves, almost tastes them by looking. Sandwich, ham and his descendants, mustard and bread there. Potted meats. What is a home without Plumtree's potted meat? Incomplete. What a stupid ad. Under the obituary notices, they stuck it up, all up a Plumtree. Dignam's potted meat. Cannibals would with lemon and rice. White missionary too salty, like pickled pork. Expect the chief consumes the parts of honor. Ought to be tough from exercise. His wives in a row to watch the effect. There was a royal old nigger who ate the something of the Reverend McTrigger. His 900 lives had the time of their lives. It got bigger and bigger and bigger. And then he goes on, with it an abode of bliss. Lord knows what concoction, calls, moldy tripes, windpipes, fakes, and minced up. Puzzle, find the meat. Okay, I'm going to segue into the Big Mac, 100% beef. Does it taste anything like a cut of sirloin? When they say 100% beef, what do you think you're getting? So I saw a feature on TV that talked about McDonald's as the world's biggest consumer of cattle eyeballs. The Big Mac is beef, but it's probably like tails, snouts, ears, eyes, penises. It's not the sirloin part of the meat you get. So think about that when you have a Big Mac. And additives. As Bloom is crossing the River Liffey on page 152, it's when he thinks about the taste of the Liffey. Be interesting to get a pass. He sees a barge going down the Liffey carrying Guinnesses. Be interesting someday to get a pass through Hancock to see the brewery. Regular world in itself. Fat supporter, wonderful. Rats get in too. Drink themselves bloated as big as a collie floating. Dead drunk on the porter. Drink it till they puke like Christians. Imagine drinking that. Rats, vats. Well, of course, if we know all the things. Anybody work in the food industry and have like horror stories to tell about what goes into the food that's served to the public? Or has anybody read the Food and Drug Administration's guidelines on what's allowable in food that's marketed to the public? You're allowed to have a certain number of insects and a certain number of rat turds and insects. There are regulations, but the only way to ensure you're getting good, clean food is to make it yourself. So I'm going to drop the attention to the range of things that Joyce looks at in this chapter. And notice also it's not simply food as an object, but the way that people eat becomes a kind of study here. You've got the slobs in the Burton Hotel that cause Bloom to back out because they're talking with their mouths full and like dribbling on themselves. And at the end of the chapter, when Bloom helps the blind stripling cross the street, you notice there's slobbered food all over the front of his shirt. Some people eat that way. I kind of do. On page 161, he thinks about Mrs. Purefoy's husband. They're Methodists. Poor Mrs. Purefoy, Methodist husband, method in his madness, saffron bun and milk and soda lunch in the educational dairy, eating with a stopwatch, 32 chews to the minute. Still his mutton chop whiskers grew. So there are books and articles you can read that will tell you like how many times you're supposed to chew to maximize the nutrition you get out of food. And I've got a copy of an article in the flyleaf of my book here, just published last year, that talks about the length of time you take to eat has an effect on your weight. If you eat fast, you tend to get heavier more quickly. So eating slower is a way of dieting. There are all kinds of advice on like how you should eat. There's also the square meal, which the Methodist method of eating reminds me of. If you're the son or daughter of somebody in the military, you might have been trained to eat with military rigor. And then, of course, there's Nosy Flynn, whose drops are falling out of his nose into his food and doesn't face him. And on 154, we've got the sandwich board men walking down the street, eating while they're walking. It's like adolescence in Berkeley. You get to be 16 in Berkeley, and these triangular slices of pizza get affixed to your chin. But some people walk and eat at the same time. I don't do that. I like to sit down when I eat. Also, food is, go back to that line, eat pig like pig. Food is an index to character, and there are various points in the chapter where Bloom associates people to what they eat. So we go back to that paragraph about Dilly Daedalus, potatoes and marge and potatoes, that child's underfed. It's the potato chip diet of eating like just a lot of starch. The Dan White diet of 1904. You all know about Dan White, the guy who shot Mayor Moscone and Harvey Milk? When he was on trial for murder, his defense was that he was unhinged because he ate nothing but Hostess Twinkies for a month, and it put him off. The Twinkies defense, very famous. Well, I assume if you eat Twinkies for a month, your thinking's not going to be entirely straight. And then on page 174 and 175, Bloom remembers that Blazes Boylan has come out of the Red Bank restaurant, which served oysters. Oysters, of course, are aphrodisiacal, but Bloom also thinks that oysters eat sewage, as they do. I had a scientist friend, a malaria expert, who wouldn't eat oysters because she said it was like playing Russian roulette. You get the wrong oyster and you die. I think the risk is worth it. And then, of course, you have the vegetarians producing poetry. Let me leave you off with some reflections on what Joyce said in his schema was the art of the chapter, architecture. How do we get there? Well, God wants a blood victim. Blood goes into the foundation stone of a building. And there are lots of descriptions of like the street front of Dublin. On page 183, as Bloom is going to the library and museum, he thinks what a handsome building it is. Elsewhere, he thinks about how the city is constantly filled with renters who come and go. And the significance of the architecture for me was revealed by the Wonder Bread commercial. Wonder Bread helps build strong bodies 12 different ways. Or by a New Testament verse, Jesus says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will build it up. You can wreck your body, run it into the ground, and you put good food into it, and you can build it up from scratch. Now, it happens that, food is the building block of the body, and the body is the building block of the city. Food is at the bottom of the architecting process of the city. Three times in the chapter, we're told that the Dublin Corporation is having a meeting today. Corporation comes from the Latin word corpus, meaning body. And I need chalk for this last part. I gave you a map. Did anybody follow it? What did you find? Did you find any pattern? Okay. Bloom starts out at the candy store, walks down O'Connell Street, over the bridge to Grafton Street. About here he meets Mrs. Breen, has his conversation. He walks further down Grafton Street and looks in the windows of these department stores and thinks about buying Molly some lingerie. Then he goes into Duke Street and goes to the Burton Hotel, sees these guys eating like slobs, decides he doesn't want to eat there, and so he goes back to Davy Burns, has his gorgonzola cheese sandwich, and then leaves. At this point, one of the characters, Tom Rochford, has dyspepsia. At this point, Bloom sees the dog throwing up sick nutty cud and lopping it up again. Over here, he stands in front of the store window of a plumber and looks at toilet bowls. And here he helps the blind stripling cross the street, and here he meets Boylan. So does that evoke anything? It's like the giant Laestrygonian. With Bloom meeting Boylan right at this very foul spot. And there's a sentence in the chapter where Bloom says, I feel like I've been eaten and spewed. So we're meant to see him going through the body of a giant cannibal Laestrygonian. Oh, and I forgot to tell you, in that passage about the limerick, the cannibals, people are people who eat people, and the part that they're eating is the penis, because there are people who eat those things, too. We're getting into Jeffrey Dahmer terrain here. Let me just close by suggesting that the chapter is showing us our immense dependency on matter and on food, and making us aware of things of which we're unconscious. Do you know any character we've read about eats? The captain of the secret sharer, John Marcher, do they eat food? It's making us aware of our dependency on food, but also, as Freud reminds us, that the process of eating and alimentation has given us a lot of ways of thinking about the way that we think, and that thinking may actually be a kind of form of digestion. Jacques Derrida has an essay called Economimesis, where he talks about learning as a kind of process of digestion. In the classical view of learning, sense impressions come into your head and make dings, impressions in your head, and you've got this knowledge that you can jockey around. But all of us know the experience of learning something often means taking something in and gradually letting it assimilate and become part of your body. It's incorporated, as Freud says, or introjected. It becomes part of you slowly by a process of digestion. And just think of all the expressions we use that are based on food. I can't swallow that. I find it distasteful or disgusting. It makes me fret, from the German fretten, meaning to eat. Let's chew the cud, let's chew the fat, let's ruminate, and so on and so forth. Okay, I'll leave you at that. Monday we'll start Faulkner.